All right, listener. So you sent us some pretty intense commentary on this U.S. election, huh?
Yeah.
It's pretty clear the speaker is deeply troubled by the outcome,
Hmm.
even using the word catastrophic
Yeah.
to describe it.
Yeah.
So get ready for a deep dive into their perspective.
And it's overflowing with raw emotion.
Yeah.
What strikes me right away is just the sheer intensity of their distress.
Right.
This isn't just like disappointment or,
Yeah.
just a typical reaction.
Right.
This is a profound sense of loss and fear
Totally.
about what the future holds.
Yeah, you really pick up on that dread in their words.
Yeah.
They don't seem to think this election was just a typical political contest,
Right.
but a sign that something fundamental has shifted
Mm-hmm.
and not for the better.
Yeah, it's like they see this election as a symptom
Yeah.
of a much deeper societal malaise.
Interesting.
They even talk about a resurrection and refer to specific charges against the elected official.
Oh, wow.
Although they don't really go into detail about what those are.
Okay.
Do you know what they're referencing there, listener?
Yeah.
It might be helpful to have that context as we unpack their concerns.
That's a good point. It's easy to get lost in the emotional whirlwind of their words.
Right.
But we should try to understand the specifics they're
Yeah.
grappling with. So let's unpack some of those key concerns.
Okay.
Starting with their claim that this election wasn't just about policy disagreements.
Right. They argue that it was all about the manipulation and amplification of hatred.
Wow.
And they point to a pretty chilling example.
Okay.
Those reports of over 40 fake bomb threats called into Democratic-leaning polling stations
Oh.
traced back to Russia.
Mm.
It's almost as if they're saying, look, this isn't just about political differences anymore.
Right.
It's about deliberate attempts to sow chaos and fear.
And that fear really permeates their entire commentary.
Yeah.
They seem convinced that only a select few actually benefit from this outcome. Specifically naming autocrats, billionaires like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk,
Wow.
and of course Putin.
Right.
It's a pretty stark picture they're painting.
Yeah.
Almost like a scene from a dystopian novel where the powerful elite exploit the chaos for their own gain.
It definitely raises some questions about the influence of wealth in politics, wouldn't you say?
Oh, for sure.
I mean, we've seen debates about campaign finance reform
Right.
and the role of lobbying for years.
Exactly.
This commentary seems to suggest that those issues are now front and center
Yeah.
with potentially dire consequences.
They also express deep concern for Black women, saying they overwhelmingly oppose the winning candidate,
Right.
but were essentially let down by a large segment of the white population.
Mm-hmm.
It's heartbreaking to hear that sense of betrayal and disillusionment.
It speaks to the complexities of identity politics
Yeah.
and the feeling of being marginalized
Right.
within a system that's supposed to represent everyone.
Right.
They seem to be saying, look, we showed up, we voted, but it wasn't enough to overcome these other forces at play.
Right.
It's a powerful statement about the ongoing struggle for equality and representation.
And they don't just limit their concerns to the U.S. either.
Right.
They see this election as having global implications,
Mm-hmm.
potentially emboldening those who seek to harm and oppress others worldwide.
It's like they're saying, look, the world is watching, and this result sends a dangerous message
Wow.
about what's acceptable, what's tolerated.
Yeah.
They specifically mention concerns for marginalized communities,
Right.
even going so far as to say this outcome might embolden rapists.
That's
It's a chilling thought.
It is a chilling thought.
Yeah.
Speaking of chilling, their description of social media reactions is pretty disturbing.
Oh, yeah.
They call it a swamp.
Ugh.
And the examples they give men celebrating the potential curtailing of women's bodily autonomy are truly unsettling.
Yeah, it's really disturbing.
It makes you wonder about the role of online platforms in amplifying these kinds of extreme viewpoints.
Absolutely. We've seen how social media algorithms can create these echo chambers.
Right.
People are only exposed to information that affirms their existing beliefs.
Right.
This commentary seems to suggest that those echo chambers are now spilling over into the real world
Yeah.
with potentially disastrous consequences.
And then there's their focus on Seth Abramson,
Right.
an award-winning journalist and author, and his predictions for the future.
Yeah.
They seem to take his forecasts very seriously,
Right.
almost as a roadmap for the dystopian nightmare they believe is unfolding.
Abramson's predictions are certainly alarming, to say the least.
Yeah.
He's talking about potential genocide in Gaza and Ukraine, threats to NATO and the EU,
Wow.
a crackdown on dissent here at home, increased police brutality,
Wow.
and unchecked exploitation by billionaires.
That's a
very bleak outlook.
bleak is putting it mildly.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're saying, buckle up, folks, because things are about to get really bad.
Yep.
And in a way, their reliance on Abramson's predictions almost gives their fears a sense of legitimacy.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're seeking validation for their anxieties,
Right.
looking for an expert voice to confirm their worst fears.
Right.
But even if we take Abramson's predictions with a grain of salt,
Sure.
it's important to understand the fears that are driving this perspective.
Yeah.
What stands out to you about these predictions, listener?
Yeah.
Do any of them resonate with your own concerns about the future?
It's definitely a lot to process.
Yeah.
And amidst all this doom and gloom,
Right.
the speaker ends with a call to action, organize resistance. They seem to believe that making America great again now falls to those who oppose the election's outcome.
Interesting.
It's almost a rallying cry,
Yeah.
but with this heavy sense of foreboding.
Yeah. What's striking to me is how they framed this resistance.
Yeah.
It's not just about, like, political activism or advocating for specific policies. It's about, like, fighting for survival.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
for preserving a way of life that they believe is under attack.
Yeah, they even use the phrase taking their lives in their hands,
Right.
which evokes this image of a dangerous, almost revolutionary struggle. It's pretty intense language.
It is, and it raises an important question for you, listener. How do you feel about this call to action?
Right.
Does it resonate with you, or do you find it too extreme?
Throughout their commentary, they repeatedly draw comparisons to Nazi Germany,
Yeah.
using phrases like 1930s Germany and 1940s Germany to describe what they fear is coming. Those are some pretty loaded historical parallels.
They're definitely meant to evoke a sense of alarm,
Right.
to suggest that we're on this slippery slope towards authoritarianism and oppression.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that historical comparisons can be tricky.
Oh, totally.
While there might be some valid points of comparison,
Right.
it's also possible to oversimplify or misinterpret the past.
They also claim that the election result was not democratic and decry the influence of billionaires bankrolling certain candidates.
Right.
It seems to tap into a broader distrust of political systems
Absolutely.
and the concentration of wealth and power.
And that's a sentiment we're hearing more and more these days.
Yeah.
Not just in the U.S., but around the world.
Right.
People are feeling increasingly disillusioned with traditional political institutions.
Right.
And they're looking for answers,
Yeah.
for someone to blame for the problems they see.
But it's interesting how they seem to contradict themselves at times.
Oh, yeah.
They rail against generalizations about certain groups,
Uh-huh.
but then make sweeping statements about idiots who voted a certain way
Right.
or multifaceted privileges protecting others.
Yeah.
It feels a bit inconsistent.
It does highlight a potential weakness in their argument.
Yeah.
It's one thing to critique systems and structures,
Right.
but it's another to resort to personal attacks or broad brush generalizations. It can make their overall argument feel less credible and ultimately less persuasive.
They also seem to hold a very pessimistic view of human nature.
Yeah.
They claim that people only learn through pain and predict widespread suffering as a result of this election.
Wow.
It's almost like they're reveling in the potential for doom and gloom.
It's definitely a bleak outlook.
Yeah.
And while it's understandable to feel despair and anger after a disappointing election,
Right.
dwelling solely on negativity can be paralyzing.
Yeah.
It can prevent us from seeing opportunities for positive change,
Right.
for coming together to address the challenges we face.
They also talk about hypocrisy,
Yeah.
particularly among those celebrating the election outcome.
Okay.
They point to concerns about bodily autonomy
Mm-hmm.
and then highlight how many men voted for the very person they fear will restrict those rights.
It's an interesting observation about the gap between rhetoric and reality.
Yeah.
They're essentially saying, look, you can't claim to care about these issues
Right.
if you're supporting someone who has a track record of undermining them.
It's a call for consistency and accountability.
But then they turn around and make a generalization about certain groups benefiting from multifaceted privileges,
Yeah.
which seems to contradict their earlier point about avoiding generalization.
You're right. There's a tension there.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're saying we need to recognize and address systemic inequalities. But at the same time, we shouldn't make assumptions about individuals based on their group affiliation.
Right.
It's a complex issue.
Yeah.
And their commentary doesn't necessarily offer clear solutions.
Another point they make is that they constantly refer to facts and truth
Right.
as if everyone should agree with their interpretation, but they never actually delve into the specifics of those facts.
Right.
It feels a bit like they're preaching to the choir,
Yeah.
assuming their audience already shares their worldview.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
They're making a lot of assumptions about what their audience already knows or believes.
For example, they mention the resurrection and specific charges against the elected official.
Right.
But they don't explain what those are.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder who they're really speaking to.
Yeah.
Are they trying to persuade those who disagree with them?
Right.
Or are they simply reinforcing the beliefs of those who are already on board with their perspective?
It's almost like they're speaking a coded language
Yeah.
that only those within a certain bubble can understand.
Exactly. And that can be a real barrier to constructive dialogue.
Right.
If you're only speaking to those who already agree with you, you're not really engaging in a meaningful exchange of ideas.
It also makes it difficult to assess the validity of their claims.
Right.
Without knowing the specifics of the facts they're referencing.
Yeah.
It's hard to determine whether their conclusions are justified.
That's where critical thinking comes in when you say, listener.
Yeah.
It's not about blindly accepting what you hear,
Right.
but about evaluating the evidence, considering different perspectives,
Right.
and forming your own informed opinions.
And that brings us back to their call for organized resistance.
Yeah.
They seem to believe that the only way to make America great again is through active opposition to the current leadership.
Right.
It's a powerful message,
It is.
but it's also a risky one.
There's a long and complicated history of resistance movements,
Yeah.
both successful and unsuccessful.
Right.
It's important to understand the potential consequences of such actions,
Right.
both positive and negative.
They also warn that resistance will come at a cost.
Mm.
They specifically mention taking their lives in their hands,
Right.
which evokes images of violent crackdowns and oppression.
It's a stark reminder that challenging the status quo can be dangerous,
Yeah.
and those who choose to do so may face serious consequences.
Right.
It's important to weigh those risks carefully
For sure.
and to take appropriate precautions to protect yourself and your loved ones.
So we've explored the emotional core of this perspective, unpacked some of its logical inconsistencies, and grappled with its bleak outlook.
Right.
But there's still one big question looming. What can we as individuals do with this information?
Right.
How do we move forward in a world that feels increasingly uncertain and polarized?
That's the challenge we're left with, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's a challenge we'll explore further in the final part of this deep dive.
Yeah, it feels like we're walking this tightrope, between acknowledging the speaker's anxieties and not getting swept away by their pessimism. It's a tough balance.
You've hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the negativity, especially when it's expressed with such raw emotion.
Right.
But we can't let that paralyze us.
Right.
We need to find a way to process this information, to learn from it,
Yeah.
and ultimately to move forward.
So how do we do that?
Right.
What's the antidote to this sense of doom and gloom?
Well,
what concrete steps can we take?
first and foremost, I think we need to resist the urge to retreat into our own echo chambers.
Good.
This commentary we've been dissecting is a perfect example of what can happen when we only engage with information that confirms our existing beliefs.
Right.
We become more entrenched in our views, less open to dialogue,
Yeah.
and ultimately less able to understand the complexities of the world around us.
It's like building a mental fortress around ourselves, convinced that we have all the answers while everyone else is lost in the dark.
Exactly. And while that fortress might feel safe and reassuring,
Yeah.
it also shuts out any possibility of growth or change. It prevents us from seeing the bigger picture, the nuances, the different perspectives that are essential for navigating a complex world.
So how do we break out of those echo chambers?
Right.
It feels like everyone is so dug into their own trenches these days.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin to bridge that divide?
It starts with a conscious choice to seek out diverse perspectives.
Okay.
Even, and perhaps especially those that challenge our own assumptions. Make a deliberate effort to engage with information that makes you uncomfortable, that pushes you to think critically and question your own beliefs.
But that's easier said than done, right? It seems like everyone is shouting their opinions these days, but no one is really listening.
You're right. It takes effort.
Yeah.
It requires a willingness to be open-minded, to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers, and to approach conversations with a genuine desire to understand rather than to win an argument.
The speaker in this commentary seems to believe that facts speak for themselves,
Right.
but we've seen how those facts can be